Welcome back to True Echo, where forgotten voices find justice, where hidden truths come roaring back to life. Today's story is one you won't believe, a tale of resilience, betrayal, and redemption buried beneath decades of lies. An elderly black man, mocked for his tattered clothes, quietly revealed a secret so powerful it shook an entire institution to its core. Stay with us as we uncover a battle for justice that took a lifetime, and ended with a shocking twist no one could have seen coming. The heavy glass doors of Chase Bank swung open with a groan that barely caught anyone's attention. After all, it was a slow Tuesday afternoon, and the few customers milling about barely looked up from their phones or half-hearted conversations. But as the figure stepped inside, an old black man hunched under the weight of a battered canvas bag slung over one shoulder. A few curious glances flickered his way. His coat, a thick brown mass stitched in places with crude thread, was dusted with the grime of years. His shoes were almost soleless, making a soft scraping sound against the polished marble floors. A woman in a tailored suit pulled her designer purse closer to her chest, her lips tightening in suspicion. A young teller standing behind the main counter, Martin, nudged his co-worker Josh and nodded toward the door, muttering under his breath, "Guess we got another homeless case today." Josh chuckled, his voice a whisper that dripped with contempt. "Must have wandered in here thinking it's a soup kitchen." The old man didn't react. His deep-set black eyes, calm and resolute, scanned the gleaming lobby. Without hesitation he shuffled toward the center of the bank, each step deliberate. Silence fell heavier with each passing second. Conversations halted. Even the background hum of the printers and cash counters seemed to muffle themselves. Stephen Miller, the head of security, immediately noticed the disturbance. A large, broad-shouldered white man in a neatly pressed uniform, Stephen was well known for his short temper and his quick draw. He adjusted the strap of his holster and made his way toward the old man, already scowling. Then it happened. The old man, standing beneath the cold fluorescent lights, lifted his head and spoke in a voice that, while aged, carried the clarity of a bell. "This bank is mine." For a moment, there was only stunned silence, a heavy, unnatural pause as the absurdity of his words registered. Then came the laughter. Sharp, mocking, vicious. It echoed off the marble floors and glass partitions, growing louder as more people caught wind of the spectacle. Customers grinned and shook their heads. Bank employees exchanged smirks. Even Stephen allowed himself a cruel chuckle as he approached. "Sir," Stephen said with a mocking politeness, hand resting meaningfully on his belt, "this isn't a place for loitering. Why don't you step outside before you embarrass yourself any further?" The old man, Elijah C.K. Kirby, didn't flinch. He didn't argue. Instead, with slow, deliberate movements, he bent down and placed his worn canvas bag on the floor. His hands trembled with age but not with fear. He began to untie the heavy string that cinched it shut. "Sir," Stephen barked again, sharper now, sensing the attention building around them. "Last warning." But Elijah ignored him. The tension thickened until it was almost unbearable. When the old bag finally opened, revealing a stack of yellowed papers and what looked like old bundles of cash, the laughter abruptly died. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. Even Stephen hesitated, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. Elijah straightened his back as much as he could, and said quietly for all to hear, "I am Elijah C.K. Kirby, the founder of Chase Bank. And I have come to take back what is mine." A stunned hush fell over the lobby. Elijah's quiet declaration echoed in the cavernous space, louder than any shout could have been. People stared, wide-eyed, as the frail old man lifted a battered, leather-bound ledger from his bag, its cover cracked and faded, but the gold-embossed letters still faintly visible. Chase Bank Ledger, 1948. Stephen Miller instinctively shifted his stance, one hand still hovering near his holstered sidearm. His face, usually smug and domineering, now twitched with uncertainty. Something about Elijah's voice, the absolute certainty in it, had rattled him more than he wanted to admit. Behind the counter, James Temp, the bank manager, watched closely. His forehead creased into a deep frown. James was a company man through and through, a true believer in the Matthews family, who had supposedly founded this branch generations ago. But something about this wasn't adding up. "Sir," James said, stepping forward cautiously, forcing his tone to stay polite, "you're making some very serious claims. If you really believe—" "I don't believe," Elijah interrupted, his voice steady as stone. "I know." He laid the ledger gently on the marble counter like it was a sacred relic. Slowly he flipped it open, revealing page after page of handwritten notes, accounting records, and signatures in ink faded by time. Near the front, in careful, elegant cursive, was scrawled, Elijah C.K. Kirby, founder and president, Chase Bank, Incorporated 1948. Gasps rippled through the growing crowd. Even some of the customers, who moments earlier had laughed the loudest, now leaned forward with widened eyes. A young woman near the door pulled out her phone, starting to record, just in case this turned into something more than a bizarre afternoon distraction. Stephen scoffed loudly, trying to regain control. Old paper and some scribbles, he sneered. Could be forged. Could be anything. But even as he said it, doubt crept into his voice. Because there, tucked neatly into the ledger's opening pages, was an entire series of notarized documents. Some stamped, others sealed with wax, bearing dates from the late 1940s. Documents no forger could have easily faked, at least not convincingly enough to fool this many watchful eyes. James Temp's hands twitched at his sides. His training screamed at him to take charge, to dismiss this nonsense and restore order. But another voice, deeper, quieter, told him to listen. He looked at the tattered ledger, at Elijah's worn hands trembling with age but not with fear, and something inside him shifted. "You'll have to forgive my skepticism," James said, his voice lower now, more respectful. "If this is real, if you are who you say you are, then you deserve to be heard properly." Stephen spun around, his face red with anger. "You can't be serious, James? You're gonna entertain this circus?" But James wasn't looking at Stephen anymore. He was looking at Elijah, and, perhaps, at something much bigger than one old man with a bag full of dusty papers. "I'm serious," James said simply. Then, addressing Elijah directly, "Please, Mr. Kirby, tell us your story. Start from the beginning." A tense murmur rose from the crowd. Customers and staff alike edged closer, drawn in by the raw gravity of the moment. Elijah nodded slowly. He closed his eyes for a beat, gathering himself before speaking. "In 1948, he began, I was a young man with nothing but a dream and a pair of calloused hands. They said a black man couldn't build a bank in this town. They said I was a fool. But I worked day and night, raising the first funds, signing the first papers, laying the foundation with sweat and blood." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "For a few shining years, Chase Bank wasn't just a place to store money. It was a symbol, a black-owned institution where people of color could build futures for themselves." The room seemed to lean closer, hanging on every word. Even Stephen, though still stiff with distrust, found himself listening despite himself. "But greed," Elijah continued, his voice hardening, "and prejudice are powerful things. My partner, John Williams, a man I trusted like a brother, he saw an opportunity. He colluded with men like the Matthews family. They forged papers. They bribed officials. They erased my name from the records. And when I protested, they had me arrested on false charges. Beaten. Humiliated." He lifted his gaze to James, to Stephen, to the customers staring at him with growing shock. "They stole my life's work," he said simply. "And for more than 50 years I carried the weight of that betrayal, waiting for the day I could come back and show the world the truth." The heavy silence that followed was thicker than anything before. No one laughed now. No one dared. From the back of the lobby, Emily Carter, a junior bank teller barely out of college, stepped hesitantly forward. Her voice, small but clear, broke the stillness. "Why now?" she asked. "Why wait all these years?" Elijah turned to her, a soft smile flickering across his weathered face. "Because truth," he said, "is like a seed planted deep underground. No matter how long it sleeps, no matter how dark the earth, it will always find its way to the light." The words hung in the air, trembling with power. James swallowed hard, feeling the weight of history pressing down on him. He knew in that moment that he was standing at a crossroads, one path leading to silence and safety, the other to chaos and truth. And he also knew that whichever choice he made, there would be no going back. James Temp's heart hammered against his ribs as he faced the silent lobby, his mind racing through the consequences he already saw unfolding. He was no fool. If Elijah Kirby's claims were true, and the dusty ledger in his hands suggested they very well might be, it meant the very foundation of Chase Bank's legacy was a lie. A scandal like this wouldn't just stain the bank. It would shatter it. And yet, when he looked into Elijah's eyes, those deep, battle-scarred eyes that had weathered decades of injustice, James couldn't summon the will to dismiss him. Not this time. Not for the sake of comfort or reputation. Stephen Miller, however, wasn't ready to surrender so easily. "This is insane," he muttered, stepping between Elijah and the growing crowd. "You expect us to believe some old man's fairy tales over 100 years of bank history? Over the Matthews family?" His voice carried anger, but underneath it there was fear. Fear that the world he knew, the order he trusted, was crumbling right in front of him. Elijah didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly reached back into the canvas bag and withdrew another item, a stack of oilskin-wrapped documents tied with brittle twine. The old man placed them carefully on the counter. "These are the original contracts," he said calmly. "The deeds. The articles of incorporation. My signature clear as day. And no transfer of ownership that includes me." James hesitated only for a moment before stepping closer, his hands trembling slightly as he untied the brittle cords. When he peeled back the oilskin, the scent of old paper and time filled the air. He lifted the top document carefully. His eyes scanned the aged yellowed pages, and there it was. Elijah C.K. Kirby. Signed. Seal. Stamp. The next paper. And the next. Nowhere was there any indication that Elijah had sold, transferred, or forfeited his ownership. It was like finding a skeleton buried beneath a beautiful mansion, undeniable and damning. James's face paled visibly. He looked up, meeting the gaze of every customer and employee still frozen around them. And then he did the unthinkable. He turned back to Elijah and bowed his head. Not deeply, not dramatically, but enough to say, "I believe you." The shift in the room was immediate. Emily Carter, the junior teller who had first stepped forward, gasped audibly. Josh, the young man who had earlier mocked Elijah, now shrank back, shame coloring his face. Stephen's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel the tide turning, and he didn't like it one bit. "This doesn't prove anything," Stephen barked, louder now, desperate. "Old paper means nothing. Anyone could fake this." But his voice lacked conviction now. Even he could hear it. Elijah didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "If you truly believe that, call the authorities. Call the best forensic experts you have. Let them examine the documents. I have waited 50 years. I can wait a few more days." It was a masterstroke. The invitation was so calm, so confident, that it sucked all the aggression out of the air. If this was a hoax, Elijah was the greatest actor alive, and nobody truly believed that anymore. James set the documents carefully on the counter and faced the growing crowd. "I intend to verify all this properly," he said, voice steady. "Until then, no action will be taken against Mr. Kirby. He has the right to be here, and to have his voice heard." There was a slow, tentative ripple of nods among the staff and customers. Except for Stephen, who looked like he might explode. "You're risking your career." Stephen spat, jabbing a finger at James. "You're risking everything." "For what?" "A story." James met his gaze without blinking. "For the truth," he said simply. A deep, crackling silence followed, broken only when Elijah stepped forward one small, humble pace. He placed a trembling hand gently on the counter, steadying himself. "I didn't come here today looking for revenge," Elijah said softly. "I came because I'm tired of being invisible. Tired of carrying a history everyone else decided to forget." He straightened up as much as his old bones allowed and looked out over the stunned faces around him. "History is written by those in power. But truth." He smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Truth waits. And today, truth walked through your front door." Somewhere near the back, a customer clapped, just once. Another followed. Then another. It wasn't a roaring ovation. Not yet. But it was enough. Enough to shift the energy from mockery and suspicion, to respect. To something dangerously close to hope. Stephen's face twisted in fury. "You'll regret this," he muttered darkly to no one in particular. And without another word, he stormed toward the exit, slamming the door behind him. Nobody stopped him. Inside, the atmosphere shifted once again. The bank lobby, once a sterile shrine to cold money, suddenly felt alive, like something new, something fragile and breathtaking, was beginning to grow. James looked at Elijah, a new weight settling on his shoulders. He knew this wasn't over. Far from it. The Matthews family wouldn't take this lying down. There would be lawyers. Press conferences. Maybe worse. But he also knew something else, something far more important. Today he had chosen the right side of history. He extended his hand across the counter. "Mr. Kirby," he said, voice rough with emotion, "I think we have a lot of work to do." Elijah looked at the young man's outstretched hand. For a moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, his weathered fingers closed around James's hand, a handshake that seemed to echo through the very bones of the building itself. The fight for justice had only just begun. And this time, Elijah Kirby would not be standing alone. Outside, the wind howled against the bank's wide glass windows as a storm gathered in the distance. A fitting backdrop for what was about to unfold inside Chase Bank's spotless lobby. James Temp and Elijah Kirby stood side by side, the unlikely center of a growing crowd of employees and customers still processing what they had just witnessed. In James's mind, the decision had already been made. The truth would not be buried again. But in his gut, he knew what was coming: retaliation. The Matthews family wasn't just rich. They were powerful. They practically owned Rockview, the businesses, the courts, the local press. Exposing them would be like stepping in front of a moving train and daring it to stop. Still, James squared his shoulders. It didn't matter. Some battles were worth fighting even if they crushed you. "Mr. Kirby," he said quietly, glancing at the worn man beside him, "if you're willing, we need to formalize this. Documents. Witness statements. Proof. Because once we step forward, the Matthews family will come after you with everything they have." Elijah gave a small, tired smile. The smile of someone who had lived too long under threats to be frightened by one more. "I've waited 50 years for this moment," he said simply. "I can wait a few more weeks." James nodded grimly. He turned to Emily Carter and Josh, both still standing at respectful attention behind the counter. "Emily, get me a copy machine. Josh, start photographing every document Mr. Kirby brought in. I want everything backed up and time-stamped before we even think about moving forward." They nodded immediately and hurried to obey. Meanwhile, the customers who remained, those not paralyzed by fear or guilt, began murmuring among themselves, some stepping forward with tentative offers to witness what was happening. A few even gave Elijah quiet nods of support. Not everyone, though. In the corner of the lobby, near the teller line, a man in an expensive gray suit tapped angrily on his phone. He wore a gold watch so bright it almost gleamed under the lights. Gordon Matthews III, a minor cousin of the family dynasty, had been there during the entire ordeal, lurking in the shadows. And he was not happy. Within minutes, the first call came. James picked up the bank's direct line with a pit in his stomach. "James Temp," he answered, voice carefully neutral. "James," came the voice on the other end, smooth, oily, and full of restrained menace. It was Gregory Matthews, current chairman of Chase Bank's parent board. "I hear you've had a situation." James swallowed. "We're handling it, sir." "Handling it?" Gregory chuckled darkly. "You're listening to a lunatic waving around trash from the 1940s like it means something. I'm ordering you to remove him from the premises immediately." James gripped the receiver harder, glancing instinctively at Elijah, who stood quietly a few feet away, as if sensing the battle being fought in silence. "I'm sorry, sir," James said carefully. "I can't do that. He has presented credible historical evidence. We are legally obligated to." "You listen to me, son," Gregory interrupted, his voice turning cold as steel. "If you don't fix this, if you don't get that man out of our bank by the end of the day, you can pack your office tonight. And don't think for a second you'll work in this town again." The line went dead. James stared at the phone for a long moment before gently setting it down. The threat hung heavy in the air, unspoken but understood by everyone watching. James Temp's career was officially on the line. But then a surprising thing happened. Emily Carter returned, holding the freshly copied documents, her young face tight with fear and determination. "I made 6 copies, sir," she said. "Stored 3 digitally. Uploaded 2 sets to cloud storage. If they try to erase this, they won't succeed." Josh stepped forward too, holding his phone high. "I recorded the whole thing," he said. "Front to back." For the first time in what felt like hours, James felt a surge of fierce pride. He wasn't alone. He turned back to Elijah. "Mr. Kirby," he said, voice stronger now, "we're going to get you your day in court." Elijah simply nodded, not with triumph but with quiet, exhausted relief. But it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The heavy glass doors of the bank suddenly swung open with a gust of cold wind. 2 sharply dressed men in dark suits entered, flashing police badges. "Good afternoon," one of them said curtly, his tone icy. "We're here on behalf of the Rockview Municipal Authority. We've had complaints about a disturbance." James stiffened. Of course. The Matthews family wasn't going to wait for the courts. They were trying to shut this down now. The lead officer, a tall man with short-cropped hair and dead eyes, turned toward Elijah. "We're going to need you to come with us, sir." Elijah stood firm, his wrinkled hands folded calmly in front of him. "On what charge?" James demanded, stepping forward. The officer didn't even blink. "Suspicion of trespassing and disruption of a financial institution." There it was. The Matthews playbook: create chaos, manufacture charges, erase the problem. James's jaw tightened. No, he said firmly. This man is a legal stakeholder presenting evidence of ownership. You have no authority to remove him without a warrant. The officers exchanged a glance. Clearly they hadn't expected resistance. We have probable cause, the second officer said weakly. You have nothing, James snapped, his voice rising above the murmurs in the lobby. You touch this man without a warrant and I guarantee you, this entire bank will be a crime scene by morning. And you'll be the ones answering questions. The tension was suffocating now. Everyone waited. Watching. Finally, after a long electric pause, the lead officer gave a tight, bitter smile. Fine, he muttered. For now. Without another word, the two officers turned and walked out, the heavy doors slamming behind them. A collective exhale rippled through the lobby. But the battle was far from over. The first shot had been fired, and both sides were now fully committed. James turned back to Elijah, his face grim. They're coming for us, he said. Harder than ever. Elijah met his gaze with quiet steel. Then let them come, he said. I'm not afraid. And for the first time James realized. Neither was he. By the time the police left, the energy inside the Chase Bank lobby had shifted yet again. The tension was still there, but it had hardened into something stronger. A kind of collective resolve, especially among the younger employees and a few of the customers who had chosen to stay. The reality was clear. This wasn't just about one old man's fight anymore. It was a battle between truth and power. And the whole town would soon be watching. James Temp knew they were on borrowed time. The Matthews family had always played a long game. They had the judges, the city council, and half the police force in their back pockets. They didn't need to prove Elijah wrong. They only needed to crush him under enough red tape, suspicion, and slander to make the truth irrelevant. And yet, as James looked at Elijah Kirby, standing small and weathered but unbowed, he realized something vital. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. James moved quickly, organizing the remaining staff. He had Emily Carter make secure digital backups of every document, sending encrypted copies to trusted contacts outside the bank. Josh volunteered to drive physical copies to a nearby law office that specialized in historical property claims. It wasn't much, but it was enough to set the wheels in motion. Meanwhile, Elijah sat quietly at a customer service desk, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee someone had thoughtfully brought him. His old hands wrapped around the paper cup like it was a rare treasure. He didn't look like a man preparing for war. He looked like a man remembering, carrying the weight of every broken promise, every door slammed in his face, every courtroom where his voice had been drowned out by prejudice. Outside, dark clouds gathered thicker over Rockview. A storm was coming, literal and metaphorical. By late afternoon, the bank's doors burst open again. This time it wasn't just a couple of officers. It was the full machine. 4 sharply dressed men and women marched in, flashing legal documents with the Matthews family crest emblazoned across the tops. Their leader, a short, wiry lawyer named Duncan Hale, looked like a man born to destroy lives quietly and efficiently. I'm here to serve a cease and desist order, Hale announced loudly, waving a thick sheaf of papers. Effective immediately, all business activities related to the fraudulent claims of Mr. Elijah Kirby must stop. He turned and pointed directly at Elijah, his thin lips curling into a sneer. This man is under formal investigation for attempted fraud and forgery. The accusation hung heavy in the air. For a brief, terrible moment, James felt the room waver, felt the momentum they had built teeter dangerously. But then Elijah did something no one expected. He laughed. A deep, rich, tired laugh that seemed to shake the very walls. It wasn't the laugh of a man defeated. It was the laugh of a man who had been lied about so many times that another lie simply rolled off his back. You can investigate me all you want, Elijah said, voice strong and unwavering. But you can't erase the truth. Not this time. Duncan Hale's smug expression faltered slightly, but he pressed on. I advise everyone in this building, he said, voice rising so the gathered crowd could hear, to disengage immediately. Anyone assisting Mr. Kirby could be charged as an accessory to fraud. A low murmur rose among the employees and customers. Fear was a powerful weapon, and Duncan Hale wielded it expertly. James Temp stepped forward, planting himself firmly between Elijah and the legal team. You'll have to excuse me, James said, his voice sharp and cutting, but this bank has a duty to investigate any legitimate claims brought to its attention. If you want to stop that process, you're going to need a court order. Not just empty threats. Duncan's eyes narrowed dangerously. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Temp? James smiled grimly. No, he said. But you do. And that's why you're here. Another ripple went through the room. Elijah leaned back slightly in his chair, watching with a faint gleam in his eye. The balance of power had shifted again, subtly but unmistakably. The Matthews family's weapon of fear wasn't working the way it used to. People were starting to think. Starting to choose. Hale gritted his teeth, realizing that any overt move now, dragging Elijah out, silencing employees, would backfire spectacularly in the court of public opinion. He gathered his papers sharply. You'll regret this, he hissed, turning on his heel and storming out of the bank. As the door slammed behind him, James exhaled slowly, feeling some of the crushing pressure ease off his chest. But he knew this was only the first skirmish. Outside, thunder rumbled ominously. The real battle, the one fought not just in courts but in hearts and minds, was about to begin. Inside the lobby, Elijah stood up slowly, his joints cracking audibly. He turned to James, his voice low and steady. You understand, he said, they're not going to stop. They'll come after you too. James nodded. I know. And you're still willing to stand with me? James met his gaze without hesitation. All the way. For the first time that day, Elijah Kirby's lips trembled, not from anger or fear, but from emotion too deep for words. He simply nodded, blinking rapidly, and looked away toward the windows, where the first fat drops of rain splattered against the glass. The storm was here. But so was the truth. And this time it would not be washed away. The storm outside now pounded the windows like an army demanding entry. Inside, the Chase Bank lobby remained thick with tension, but not the same tension as before. This was different. This was defiance. James Temp, standing tall behind the counter, issued quiet, rapid instructions. All employees were to stay at their stations. No one was to engage with any third-party representatives unless James personally authorized it. Elijah Kirby was to remain as their guest, their honored guest. And most critically, every document, every recording, every piece of evidence was to be preserved under maximum security protocols. It wasn't just about protecting Elijah anymore. It was about protecting the very soul of Chase Bank, what little of it still remained. At around 4:45 p.m., just as James finished another round of tense calls to legal counsel, a black SUV pulled up outside the bank. And when the doors opened, the storm truly arrived. Gregory Matthews himself stepped out, a silver-haired man in a tailored navy suit that cost more than most people's cars. He moved like a man used to snapping his fingers and seeing the world bend to his will. Two younger men flanked him, both wearing the dark, expensive armor of corporate lawyers. When Gregory entered the bank, he didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply smiled, a tight, cold smile that sent a chill rippling through the room. Good afternoon, he said, voice dripping with false warmth. I hear we've had a little misunderstanding. James felt a bead of sweat slide down his back, but he forced himself to stay calm. He stepped forward. We've had a revelation, James said. Gregory's smile tightened by a fraction. He turned his gaze on Elijah, sizing him up the way one might assess a piece of furniture at a yard sale. So, Gregory said slowly as if humoring a child, you're the man causing all this trouble. Elijah stood tall, or as tall as his bent frame allowed. I'm the man reclaiming what's mine. Gregory chuckled, a low rumbling sound that didn't reach his eyes. You've wasted a lot of people's time today, Mr. Kirby. But I'm willing to be generous. If you leave now, quietly, we'll forget all about this little outburst. No charges. No lawsuits. You can even keep whatever junk you found in your attic. The offer, delivered so casually, hung in the air like a rotten smell. James saw a flicker of something pass across Elijah's face, not temptation but sadness. Sadness that after all these years, men like Gregory still believed they could buy dignity for pennies. Elijah didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his battered canvas bag one last time, and withdrew a single folded letter, sealed with a crumbling wax stamp. This, Elijah said quietly, is the original agreement. The founding contract. It bears the signatures of myself and John Williams. He placed the letter on the counter, unfolding it with trembling fingers. The seal cracked but held. Gregory's eyes narrowed slightly. He recognized the document immediately. You forged this, Gregory said, voice harder now. It won't stand up in court. Elijah's eyes gleamed, fierce and unbroken. I didn't forge anything, he said. You and your ancestors forged a lie. At that moment, the lobby door opened again, and a flood of reporters poured in, cameras flashing, microphones extending. Word had spread faster than wildfire. Elijah Kirby, the forgotten founder of Chase Bank, was front-page news. Gregory's face drained of color. The trap he thought he had set was now closing around him. Reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Kirby, do you plan to sue for damages? James Temp, are you confirming Chase Bank's real history was buried? Gregory Matthews, will your family apologize?" Gregory lifted his hands defensively, but it was too late. The cameras caught everything: his scowl, his arrogance, his silence. James stepped up, standing beside Elijah, facing the flashing bulbs. "Today," James said, "is not about revenge. It's about justice. Today we acknowledge the truth. Today we return what should never have been taken." A stunned silence followed, broken only by the sound of shutters clicking and pens scribbling. Gregory Matthews turned on his heel and stormed out of the bank, his lawyers scrambling to follow. No more threats. No more offers. Just rage and defeat. As the doors slammed shut behind him, a huge collective exhale swept through the lobby. Emily Carter wiped a tear from her cheek. Josh grinned openly. Even some of the customers who had stayed began to clap, hesitant at first, but growing louder and stronger with each passing second. And in the center of it all stood Elijah Kirby. Silent, steady, victorious. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the sound of that applause wash over him like rain after a long, brutal drought. For 50 years he had been silenced, forgotten, erased. Today the world remembered, and they would never forget again. The sound of applause filled the once cold marble halls of Chase Bank, reverberating against the high ceilings and polished walls. For Elijah C.K. Kirby, it felt almost unreal, like standing inside a dream he had once dared not hope for. He didn't raise his fists in victory. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, quiet and dignified, as the truth finally lifted him out of the shadows where history had buried him. James Temp, standing at Elijah's side, felt something powerful rise inside his chest, a mixture of pride, sorrow, and awe. He had helped turn the tide today, but the real hero was the frail old man gripping a battered canvas bag like it was made of gold. As the clapping died down, a reporter pushed a microphone toward Elijah. "Mr. Kirby," she said breathlessly, "what do you plan to do now that the truth is out?" Elijah thought for a long moment. The room leaned in, hanging on his answer. Finally he smiled, a gentle, heartbreaking smile, and said, "I plan to live the rest of my days free of anger. To walk through this town knowing that my story, our story, wasn't erased after all." Another round of soft applause followed. James couldn't stop the lump forming in his throat. He turned and addressed the crowd himself. "From this day forward," James said clearly, "we will honor the true founder of Chase Bank, Mr. Elijah C.K. Kirby. And we will ensure that future generations know this institution was built by his hands, not stolen by the ones who thought money could rewrite history." He gestured toward the lobby wall, the place where portraits of the supposed founders hung. Then, in front of everyone, James reached up, grabbed the largest frame, the portrait of Gregory Matthews' grandfather, and pulled it down with a resounding crack as it hit the floor. A few people gasped, but most broke into wild applause. James turned back to Elijah. "It's time your portrait went up there instead," he said simply. For the first time in a long, long life filled with betrayal and silence, tears welled up in Elijah's eyes. But they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of peace. Later that evening, after the reporters had filed out, after the staff had finally begun locking up the doors, James and Elijah sat alone in the empty bank lobby, watching the storm outside finally break apart into a soft drizzle. "You know they'll still come after you," Elijah said, his voice low. James nodded. "I'm ready." "You might lose everything," Elijah warned gently. James smiled slightly. "Maybe. But at least this time, it'll be for something that matters." There was a long pause, the kind of silence that says everything words cannot. Two men from different worlds, different eras, bound now by truth, sacrifice, and courage. Finally, Elijah rose from his seat, gripping his cane. He walked slowly to the bank's front doors, pausing to glance back one last time. "I was never chasing money," he said softly, almost to himself. "I just wanted a place where a man's worth wasn't judged by the color of his skin, but by the content of his heart." He smiled at James one final time, a smile full of gratitude and pride, then stepped into the night, the rain slicking the streets under the glow of the streetlights. Not as a forgotten man. Not as a nobody. But as Elijah C.K. Kirby, the rightful founder of Chase Bank, whose story had finally been set free. Inside the bank, James turned off the lights one by one, leaving only a single spotlight shining over the ledger, the book that had started it all. He looked at it for a long time, his hand resting lightly on its cover. History had tried to bury Elijah Kirby. But truth, as it always does, had found its way back to the surface, unbreakable, undeniable, and beautiful. And the world, no matter how stubborn, would never be able to erase it again. At True Echo, we believe that every story deserves to be heard, especially the ones history tried to silence. Elijah Kirby's journey proves that even against overwhelming power and prejudice, truth will always find a way. What about you? When the world tries to bury your voice, will you have the courage to stand your ground? If this story touched you, like the video, share it with someone who needs inspiration, and subscribe to True Echo for more powerful stories you won't find anywhere else. Your voice matters, and together we can make sure the truth is never forgotten.